All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another exciting webinar presented by the C45 Quality Association. My name is Tom Jelanowski, and I'm the chair of the C45 Quality Association and also your host for today's webinar. We have over 30 people currently joining us, and as always, people tend to kind of come in over the last next few minutes. So before we begin, I hope you can indulge me in me kind of giving you a rundown of who the C45 Quality Association is and a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our panelist or our presenter today. So we're the C45 Quality Association, and this webinar is being presented by Dr. Bryan Shaw from our laboratory committee. Is actually chair of the lab committee. For those of you that don't know who the C45 Quality Association is, we're somewhat of a unique industry association in Canadian cannabis because we are a non-for-profit organization. We're not a lobby group. We are a membership, not corporate-backed organization, which means that our members are people involved in the legal cannabis industry, typically related or employed by license holders and labs and consultants. So our perspective and what we try to bring to the industry is from people that work directly with the plant or some ancillary service. And so what we try to do is be a unified voice of quality, lab testing, and regulations in the Canadian cannabis industry. We do that by doing a number of different things. First and foremost, we put on public and members-only events such as these. We try to do these at least monthly, depending on who we have scheduled and our availability. We'll sometimes do them 2 or 3 times a month. Thank you for joining us on another one of these. We also have in the past held quality summits. In fact, that's how this association started a few years ago, was our first summit, and that was fantastic. I remember going and thinking, wow, finally we have something to represent the quality and regulatory people in this industry. But because of COVID, we've decided to kind of hold off because there's a more intimate event. So hopefully next year, if things get a little better, we will consider having an in-person summit. But if not, then definitely consider a virtual summit again. The other thing that we do is we try to speak to our regulators, namely Health Canada, and bring the concerns of our industry association and our industry itself to Health Canada. There's been somewhat of a disconnect over the last few years because of COVID. Health Canada has not been on premises as much as they used to in the past. And so we've actually met with them twice over the last 9 months, once in person in Vancouver and once over the video. And they gave us over 2 hours each time to discuss all the issues and concerns that the industry has, especially on the quality and regulation side. So they are listening. Whether they're acting on our input remains to be seen, but so far they have been positive. So that's what we try to do. So if you're interested in learning more, check us out at c45association.com. Join our mailing list. We also have a pretty active Twitter and Instagram channel where you can kind of see about these different events and webinars. And of course, sign up for our mailing list or consider becoming a member. Prices start at $49 per year for students, $99 for non-voting members, and $199 for voting members. I believe we have nearly 150 members across Canada. We always need more because more members means more resources, means more opportunities for our members to engage with the public or the regulators or each other and network and find best practices. So I hope that's you consider joining us or at least signing up for mailing list. Okay, with that being said, a bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. It will be likely uploaded to our YouTube channel in a few weeks. We've started posting our historical archives of all the events that we've done over the last few months, and we'll continue to do that. So if you miss it or you want to review something in the future, it will be there, and let us know if it's not in about a month. We will have plenty of time for Q&A after this presentation. The presentation is about 25-30 minutes. And then after that, we'll have at least half hour for all of you to raise your hands virtually to discuss, unmute your mic if you want, and have an open discussion. We really want to encourage a very respectful and constructive discourse. But in the meantime, as you're listening to the presentation, there's a little Q&A section or button in Zoom. Please post your questions there. Everyone can see them. People can upvote them. So, we might, if we run out of time, take the most popular ones. We also have a chat box. If there's any technical issues, just let us know in the chat box. We'll address them. And of course, at the end of the day, at the end of the presentation, I'll open it up to the floor and I'll kick it off with a few questions, and then we'll go until we run out of time or questions. So I hope that all makes sense. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce Dr. Bryan Shaw at CARO. He's the Senior Technical Support Scientist and also the chair of our lab committee. And today he's going to be talking to us about cannabinoid potency testing, a subject that I think is incredibly important, has been for years, largely because potency is perhaps the single variable or metric that dictates a company's success. Unfortunately, in this industry, it drives sales, it drives provincial demand and what products they accept or keep carrying. It has excise implications, it has classification implications. And so what we're going to try to get to the bottom today is hopefully we can all walk away of what it takes to take a sample of a cannabis plant or an extract, and how a lab generates that number, and all the potential issues that can happen or errors that can be introduced throughout that sample to spreadsheet kind of process. So Dr. Bryan Shaw, if you can hear me, you can unmute yourself. The floor is yours. Please take it away. And thanks again for presenting to us today.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for that introduction. Just gonna get the slideshow going here. Okay, you should see that okay now.
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, thanks again, Tom. And thanks again to everyone who's joining in today. And as Tom said, I kind of want this presentation to be, the goal is to give the basics of potency testing and how it's done in the lab, and the connection between what's going on with the samples to the final product. And then open the floor to a discussion. I know this is something that we've all talked about, whether it be with our lab. We have a lab committee, as Tom mentioned, that I'm part of. And this comes up pretty regularly, some of the things that we're hearing and what's right and isn't right. But I think it's important to make sure that conversation's current as well. And I'd love to hear what the conversations are going on in the industry that we're not aware of, and sort of piece together then what do we do next, right? And as the C45 Quality Association, as Tom mentioned, we do sort of have the ear, at least, or the attention of Health Canada. And so is there an opportunity there to take what we learn and sort of propose maybe changes in the future? But without further ado, let's sort of get started. So what do we want to go through today? The basics are going to be just what is required for testing. I think most of us are probably pretty familiar at this point with what that is, how accuracy plays into that, sources of variability. So these are different things that have been seen throughout the industry as potential sort problems, things to look out for. We're going to talk about quality control a little bit, and then of course open up to that question period. So just very simply, why are we testing potency? I think one of the things that comes up often is maybe the attention on potency is a little bit different because it doesn't necessarily pose a health risk, for example, in the same sense that we do with pesticides or heavy metals and so on. But I think it's also important to consider that, potency is critical for someone who's taking medicinal cannabis, for example, and you're actually taking a dose specifically. So that's a place where you need to be really careful. Of course, just having a product that is well labeled and consistent helps develop trust within the industry and the consumers. I think that's really important when it comes to this sort of constant ebbs and flows between the regulated and what's the gray market. A colleague there, Andrian from RPC, reported last week or a couple of weeks ago through the C45 on some testing they did between the illicit and the regulated market. And it showed very simply that the THC is quite variable between what's on the label in the gray market versus what was found in the lab. And I think that's really important that consumers understand that. And so they want to know what they're buying, and that it's, been tested appropriately. And so, it's also, of course, it is the law, and it is under the Cannabis Act that you have certain standards of THC testing that you need to adhere to. And just to very high level, get into the basics of testing for potency. This is obviously a little bit of a cartoon just to give you a very brief overview, and I don't want to give the idea that bud goes directly into a beaker or anything like that. That's not quite how it's done, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens here. But the basics in general you see here, which is you have your sample. The sample is going to be a key component of this test. Like we always say, any result is only as good as the sample that goes into it. There's a lot of variation that can occur at the sampling. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The next step is that you have to do your extraction. So at this point, you're generally using some organic solvents, which are the goal is to remove the cannabinoids. At which point you then have your sample, which goes towards your analysis, which is going to be generally through HPLC, which you see here on the right, but there is other methods that laboratories are using. And how to, this is a sort of an analytical chemistry talk. I won't keep it, it's not going to get too detailed, don't worry. But this is a slide that pretty much is standard protocol for a lot of analytical chemistry talks, which is the accuracy and precision conversation. And when we're looking at validation of potency, for example, two of the things you're going to be looking at is the accuracy and precision. The difference between the two, one is that accuracy is how close are you to the true value of the component that you're testing, whereas precision is how close are you to that result without changing the conditions in repeated experiments. And so, the ideal is the high accuracy, high precision. And you can see where if you're highly accurate, but not precise, things can be, you can introduce variability at that point. So I just want to give that overview as we sort of move through some of these further slides to how there is a difference between the two. And then, accuracy is critical for some of the reasons we talked about earlier when it came to the testing protocol. But also if we consider, just looking at the edibles regulations, which I've got up on the screen here through Health Canada, and we can see one of the key components that we're all aware of is that 10 milligrams of THC per package, 10 milligrams per unit, depending on what the product is, right? Up to 1,000 milligrams if it's inhaling. And that's going to be really critical because if your testing is inaccurate, you could be out of compliance, you could have a recall, et cetera, if someone decided to do some spot testing and find your THC is not according to this protocol. So that's one of the places, again, where it's very important to think about the accuracy. It's not just, yes, depending on the product, we want to make sure that we're not misrepresenting the percentage of potency, particularly when we're looking for that higher end. But then there comes a point where you actually have a threshold that you need to make sure that you're under. So it plays on both sides. And that sort of plays into, this story came out, and this was 2020. I feel like this was one of the times where this seemed to catch nationwide news, in my opinion, because we saw certainly an uptake in questions about potency around the time that this story broke. This was in June 2020. There was a company facing a class action lawsuit over mislabeling of their potency. And I think this just highlights again what, if someone does sort of determine that the THC has been misrepresented on the product, this can result in a legal battle. And of course, that's another reason to sort of want to stay clear of that type of practice. And if we look at the variability limits that this is out of the Cannabis Act. Most of us have seen this at this point, but this is one of the conversations that happens regularly, which is that the result needs to be within 85 and no more than 115% of the concentration reported on the label. And this opens some questions when someone sees this. That seems like a wide range, right? And 15% on either side can be concerning. Now, it's important to remember, of course, that the amount of impact that has is going to be directly related to how much THC you're reporting in the first place. Obviously, at lower concentrations, that percentage difference isn't going to be as drastic as it will at higher concentrations. So it's important to remember that it's not that it has to be within 15% of that 25. It's not necessarily meaning that you add 15% onto 25 or reduce it. I also like to say that that's kind of the range, but it's not, shouldn't be the norm. I wouldn't expect that you're constantly fluctuating between a plus and minus 15%. So that's important to keep in mind as well. And you can see down here at the bottom, they go into a little bit more detail based on the different products and how much is in there. And so again, accuracy is really critical, because if these spot checks occur, then this is the range that you're going to have to be within. And what's the reality of, you know, testing potency and interlab variability, and even just lab variability within itself? I think this is an interesting slide to sort of discuss a bit of that conversation. So this is a couple years old at this point, but this is a round of interlab testing that was done with about 24 labs participating, as you can see here. And I think, I'm just going to see if I can find my pointer. But anyways, I'll continue. One of the things here that is really critical is, so the assigned value of this product was 7.1% THC. So this round of PT testing did include both THC and THCA. And this was the THC specifically. But you'll see here is about 7.1%. The range was from 6.1 to 10%. So that variation was 86 to 140%. So you can see right away that on the higher end, that would be a non-compliance, basically, considering what the actual assigned value was. This is a really nice way. So they use the interlaboratory data and their own data to assign this 7.1%. So that was used based off of all the different results they had. And the other thing that's important to point out here is that we have, of the methods, you know, HPLC I mentioned is typical, but you're also going to see NMR on here, UPLC. There's a few different things on here that you're also LC, MS versus UV. So there's different methods being used, right? And so it's important to recognize that, and one of the questions to always ask your lab is, what method are you using for potency? I think some of these are probably less common now. This was probably earlier on in the cannabis testing stage, and probably, I'm guessing, some of it went to more research style institutes and potentially academia. NMR would be an unusual way to do potency at this point in the game. That instrumentation alone is quite expensive. But I think it's important to show that, for example, you know, one lab did report 10% on a product that was typically around 7.1. And so that shows the type of variability that you could see between different labs. And you can kind of see the curve here of all the different, sort of the distribution of where those results played out. So potency testing, just going back to the basics, and you know, what is it? Well, we're looking at cannabinoids. Delta-9, THC, and CBD are going to be required. You can do many other cannabinoids. I traditionally think of about 16 is in a common package. And it's going to be reported as a percentage weight or milligrams per gram. And one of the big questions about this is, do you dry weight or wet weight correct? How do you report this? And this can definitely contribute to a difference in the reported value. So we generally say, and from most people I've spoken with, this seems to be the general consensus, which is we will test the product as it's delivered, as it's received. We don't manipulate it, we don't dry it or anything like that. So we just do it as sort of the consumer is going to get it as well, would be the idea. But you can, and one of the best approaches is to report your dry weight on the report as well. So have your potency on there. You can then incorporate and give an idea what the percentage moisture was, and anyone can determine from that what the variability would be. And the other question is about adding THC and THC together. Yes, this is done. And there's a calculation that we use, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But again, we know that THCA is going to convert over to THC, and so we usually contribute that into a total potency calculation. So this is one of the important questions, which is, what are the sources of variability? Because everyone wants to know, what can I do to limit this problem? You know, one of the biggest things that you don't want to see is a product that it doesn't return what's expected based on historical testing, and you know, it's the same strain, it's the same process, whatever it is, and you get surprises. And I realize that that can really lead to some, you know, financial implications and so on. So anything you can do to reduce the likelihood of that, it is always ideal. There's a few places that I think the majority of the variability is going to be found. That's the prep method, that being in the lab, the temperature, the method being used, as I showed you earlier. Different instrumentation might have different outcomes. What kind of quality controls are being used, and batch size, sampling. You know, there's different ways this is done. And I think one of the interesting things, just to focus on batch size for a second, is if we look at the guidance from Health Canada, the request is must be conducted on each lot or batch of cannabis, but it doesn't necessarily say what a batch is, other than my understanding is it can vary from very few plants to a greenhouse full, depending on how you're growing. And so I often wonder, well, how representative is one sample of a greenhouse full of plants? And at the same time, you know, how much sample is being used? In a lot of cases, we use very little, maybe half a gram to represent that entire batch. And I know there's, you know, when it comes to sampling, there's, in this case, the clients will provide the sample. There's other jurisdictions, such as in Oregon, I've heard that the laboratory actually goes in and takes the sample, and they'll take upwards of 100 grams in order to homogenize and then do testing on, which is a way of sort of combating some of these batch size issues. But again, you know, there's also a drive to reduce the amount of product that has to be given to labs. So there's a sort of a catch-22 between which way is the best approach. But with batch size, as I said, it's just a little bit ambiguous as to what that means and how it best represents the product that you're selling. So to talk about preparation a little bit, you know, one of the things that I wanted to do with this presentation is just kind of show the basics of what happens in the general potency testing. You know, it's not to be specifics about the method that we use at CARO or anything like that, or any other lab. It's just some of the things that are out there and how they're built into a method. As we know, there's no standard method for potency. There's references out there, and generally Health Canada just asks for a validation of your results, and that's all that's needed. So what are some of the things that are used in preparation? Well, one of the keys is homogenization. And this comes from a publication in Scientific Reports from 2020, where they sort of assessed different parts of the sample prep and provided data on what they returned. And I thought this was interesting. Homogenization, they did a manual grind versus an electric blender. So what you'll see is you can either grind in sort of a mortar and pestle style, or you could also do what's more like your like a, I can't remember, the magic bullet, that sort of thing, where you're actually sort of grinding it up mechanically. And I know there's other providers, lab services, who provide sort of more sophisticated grinders. And it was interesting to see here, the manual grind returned an average of about 17.5 on the total THC, whereas the electric blender averaged about 12. So that was considerable. And I think if you're doing this part of the test, you have to think about your process and maybe consider that blender, for example. Does any cannabinoids adhere to the metal? You know, that's one thing that's being very important about scraping things off or washing. I'd also wonder about how hot does that blender get, and does that contribute to any problems? So that's one thing to think about when you're one of the things you have to do is you have to take that bud, you have to grind it up, homogenize it. I think it's important to realize that we homogenize what we get. And so depending on what's received in the bag, we don't pick and choose. We're supposed to take a representative sample. So you have to think about that when you're considering what's included and how you're trimming before it comes into the lab. Solvent, there's different solvents, methanol, chloroform, isopropanol, ethanol. I've heard all these different ones. What was interesting here is that they did not see much of a difference in extraction efficiency between a methanol or a methanol chloroform mixture. So that's one thing to consider, but I think it's highlights that methanol is traditionally the most common solvent in this case. And then extraction. So one of the things I showed earlier, the beaker and the bud, but it's not quite like that. But once you homogenize your product, it gets into a container with solvent, and then you want to be as efficient as you can at extracting the cannabinoids out of that flour. This is obviously flour, oil, same thing. And so what often has happened is sonication, and they showed that the time between 10, 20, and 30 minutes did not seem to have a different effect. But sonication was slightly lower than maceration. Maceration is kind of a fancy way of saying letting it soak in the solvent for 1 day. And another thing just to point out on extraction that I've seen is when you're sonicating is what does the water temperature get to in your sonicator? So that's something to consider if you're doing this part of the test as well. So again, these are all points that could lead to variation depending on how things are being done in the lab. And speaking on that conversation about temperature, I thought this was an interesting publication. So this was done by the National Research Council of Canada, published in early 2021. And so this was entirely done on flour. And just to summarize in this study in general, what they saw is an average THCA plus THC degradation rate at 2% at 20 degrees C per month. So that's kind of interesting to think that 20 degrees C would actually not even be room temperature. And I think everyone knows that temperature has an effect on the reduction of THCA in particular, and ultimately THC and potency in general. And I thought some of the graphs that they showed here, which essentially shows that, I think at 4 degrees, minus 20, not surprisingly, you have some pretty consistent values. But in particular, once you get up over 30, 37, 40 degrees, in black, you're seeing the increase in THCA as your increase in THC as your THCA is reduced. And then ultimately you see your total THC equivalent coming down over time because you have your THCA converting to THC. Let me get to that. So what is this temperature effect? It's your THCA converting to THC followed by conversion to CBN. And you can very easily see this in your analyses. If you're testing for CBN, you'll see that CBN number go up, and we've seen that in our lab. Over time and at increased temperature, you'll see this conversion taking place. So I think that's an important factor to consider. How are you storing your samples? How are you shipping your samples to the lab? When we get into the summer months, sometimes I think about, well, how is it sitting in a courier's trunk somewhere or the back of a truck where it's quite hot? That's something to definitely think about. And there is ways to, try to keep your product cold and whatnot. This paper is also interesting. Everybody wants to check it out because they are able to make some claims about stability and shelf life going out, a year plus based on the calculations that they've run. So I think it's a nice study to sort of discuss that temperature variability. And so going back to that decarboxylation, that's another one to consider, right? And this plays into the method that's being used. And so most commonly, what you're going to see now, as I said earlier, is high performance liquid chromatography, which is on the right. On the left, I do know some labs are using gas chromatography. Really what the difference here is your GC is going to heat the product and put it into the gas phase as it hits the instrument. And so there's a column on the instrument which separates your compounds by size and polarity. And that column works thinking back to high school chemistry when we do the TLC plates and you can see colors slowly drawing up the plate. It's a similar process that goes on in the column of these instruments. And in the case of the gas, the GC, it actually converts all your THCA to THC in that heating process. So your result will only give you a THC and in the case of CBD result. Whereas LC liquid chromatography doesn't need that heating process, it keeps it in solution. And so you can get your THCA, THC, and so on values directly which are then you add a calculation to get your total potency. But I think that's also important because in some cases you're looking for THCA, and I know that there's been some studies published about some of the therapeutic benefits perhaps of THCA on its own when ingested. And so that's just another thing to look out for when it comes to the method, and this applies to that sort of decarboxylation process that occurs bringing THCA acid down into THC. And one of the last items on the list was the quality control. And I think this is a place that we don't have in the industry right now. There's a requirement to show validation, but not necessarily accreditation. And an accredited lab is going to have basically all of these quality controls. So that's just something to consider in order to obtain that accreditation. So what are some things to think about as whether you're the lab or the person providing the samples? You're gonna have a calibration curve, which is sort of a background check of standards. Looking at method blanks, and that's gonna be important, and how often, what's the frequency of your blanks. I think duplicates is an interesting conversation, only because your lab might run duplicates, which is a lab dupe, and so it's just a showing that the process being done twice will return a result within a expected concentration. But in other industries, we see duplicates from the field. And so one thing that we don't generally see is a lot of duplicates from clients where they're sort of testing us, their process from sampling to the lab, and how does it compare to sort of a duplicate analysis. You're also going to have calibration verification, which of course you need to make sure is within that control limit. Many labs will have continuing verification. So you'll have essentially a third standard, which is running through and comparing to your ongoing calibration. So these are different things that you can ask your lab is how are you calibrating your instrument? I also want to talk about proficiency testing, and does your lab participate in some of these round robin interlab studies through perhaps an accrediting body? And so that gives everyone the opportunity to sort of have a third party unbiased source that we're all comparing ourselves across. And there's also now, as this industry starts to mature, we're seeing certified reference materials, which is really nice. And so this is a sample that's provided by a third party, which is of a known value that you can add into your batches as a lab to ensure that you return the expected value. And so I just wanted to jump in some final thoughts. And the purpose of this slide is kind of to go through what have we talked about, what haven't we talked about, and what are some places to think about when you're looking at your potency. One is going to be standards. So of course, everything we do, I was talking about the calibrations and so on, you need to have standards to do this. And those are purchased from external resources. One of the things that can occur is these standards, well, especially going back a few years, I know these standards were well known to maybe not be as accurate as what was on the label, unfortunately. What's happened now is as the industry has developed, there's more providers of these standards, so you can use more than one to verify each other and so on. But another thing, going back to that THC degradation, is the standards can start to lower their concentration over time if they're not stored correctly. And that can have a sort of boosting effect on potency if you're using a standard that's inaccurately reported. Talking about duplicates, we went into that a little bit. Sample size, quality, storage, again, like I said, we test the sample as it was received. It's possible to consider, do you want to send more sample and ask to have more sample homogenized, and then we take some from that. Storage, of course, temperature is going to be important, depending on whether it's an oil, a concentrate. You might be looking at, are we removing oxygen? What's the impact of light? And sample size is another one. I think this plays into, if you're looking at edibles and your edible is 5 grams and the lab is only taking half a gram to test the product, you have to think about how consistent is the homogenization within your edible. I know that this is something that I've seen where if you're using more of a sort of a dropper process, or it's not a uniform solution, if the lab takes the wrong portion of that, it's not going to be representative. So you want to include as much of that as possible. And that's an area to look at if you're seeing data that doesn't quite make sense. I think time to testing is going to be important. We looked at sort of the shelf life and some of those calculations. So how long does it sit between harvest and hitting the lab? And is there a way to standardize that, or do you already? Moisture content, again, like we said, this is something that you may want to include on the report. How are you drying the product? You know, what temperature is that being done at? Just making sure that you're not creating a opportunity for variability there. Homogeneity we spoke about. Again, that goes back to just having the most representative sample. This question is an interesting one. How was the validation completed? And I put this here because I know that the requirement is that the lab shows a validated method, but they don't outline how it needs to be validated. So what do you need to include in your validation to make it valid? And the ones I've seen, we all provide the information that we think is relevant. And there's a lot of consistency between that, but in some cases it varies a little bit. So really, I encourage you to scrutinize those validations and ask questions. I think it's become a bit of a formality to just send the validation package. I don't know that everyone scrutinizes them to the level that they probably could. So that's just something to think about. Again, making sure there's information about accuracy and precision, as we talked about earlier. And then lastly, should there be a standard method? I think it's something that as a lab committee, we think makes sense in order to, at the very least, put everyone on the same playing field and know that you're following the same procedures. Because it only makes sense that you want probably the best method to be used for your product. And in other industries, it's generally dictated the method as a reference to something that's been developed, you know, often I think about environmental, the EPA and so on. But is that something that this industry is going to look towards? And I think ultimately it will. How that's going to come about, though, is still going to have to be worked out. But in general, I think that covers what I wanted to talk about today, just to sort of introduce the potency testing and so on. And I think now I'd love to hear what the questions are and what the thoughts are from the audience. And if anyone from the lab committee is on the call and you want to jump in here and answer questions, I encourage you to do that as well, because I think there's lots of opinions and perspectives on what's going on here.
Awesome. Thank you, Bryan, on behalf of the C45 committee, lab committee, and the Quality Association. Everyone watching, I think that was a great high-level overview and touched on a lot of interesting points. So I already see that we have about half dozen questions or so in the Q&A queue, and we will absolutely get to them. And please keep them coming, because if it's in there, then I'll do my best to get to it. I also just want to remind everyone that as we have an opportunity to have a little bit of open floor here, if you are going to say anything, just keep it respectful, keep it professional. We haven't had any issues in the past related to that, but it's always good to remind everyone. And I do just want to really encourage everyone, even if you have a comment, even if it's not a question, or if it's something I say or Bryan says or someone else says, feel free to raise your virtual hand on Zoom, and you know, I'll get to you guys in order. So Bryan, what I didn't kind of mention, or I forgot to introduce you, is you're at CARO. Just so everyone understands, at CARO you interface a lot with clients, correct? I mean, that's somewhat your role. You know what's going on in the lab, but sometimes when your laboratory or your departments need to make changes or consider specific client requests, you're always involved. So Bryan, because we were speaking right before this webinar, is a probably good resource if anyone has any questions as to what generally he has heard in the industry. And he's also a professional chemist with the Association of Chemical Professionals of BC, so he knows what he's talking about. On my end, for people that don't know, I've been involved in this industry for about 8 years now. I'm also a professional chemist here in BC and Ontario. I used to be an analytical chemist on the environmental science side. So I used to run HPLCs and GCs and other methods before I joined the cannabis industry, never for cannabis, mind you, but at the end of the day, instruments are essentially identical. And I've actually been on the quality side. You know, I'm the one calling the Bryans of the world every month going, why hasn't this lab result worked out, or what's so different? So between us two, I think we have a good holistic kind of a viewpoint of the industry from sample to spreadsheet. So before we get into it, I just want to make sure that everyone understands generally how cannabinoid analysis is done on the technical side. how HPLC is done. If you don't, just raise your hand or give me a comment here. We can cover that again. But if we're all good there, I'd like to kind of pose the first question or kind of stage the next series of questions in this light. And I want to drive this point home, Bryan. I hope you can help me here. When it comes to generating a final result, potency results, THC, CBD, whatever the case may be, there's a number of things along the kind of chain of custody from license holder, producer, all the way to lab that can go wrong. The main three things that I want people to keep in mind is the lab is only testing the sample they get, right? So the lab only gets the sample, tests the sample that they get. They only report based on the sample. But the first step is sampling itself. We know cannabis is an agricultural product. We know that there are, like you said, Bryan, people have sample sizes of, population sizes or batch sizes of 5 kilos. We have people that generate, batch sizes by the ton if you're growing outdoors or in a greenhouse. If you take a 60-gram sample, send that to the lab, is that representative of your batch? Representation is important. There's statistics that go into it. If your population is highly variable, you need a bigger sample size or maybe a different sampling method than if your population or your batch is very consistent throughout. So that's the first thing. There's a huge degree of responsibility and potential for bias at the license holder level, the person obtaining the sample, which will then propagate all the way through. The second one is at the lab sample prep, right? You've mentioned this. Different preparation methods, different solvents, temperatures, extraction methods, homogenization methods, they will produce different results. And all it takes is for an analyst to weigh slightly less or slightly more of a subsample, because that's what a lab does. They get 60 grams. They split some up for micro, some for metal, some for pesticides. Potency might only get 5 grams, right? So now you take a 500 kilo lot and now you're working on a 5-gram sample. If they bias their sample, if their scales off a bit, they can significantly bias the end result. And the last one is the analysis. And I think you and I, being, analytical chemists or having experience in analytical chemistry, you talked about the quality control that goes into each and every run, calibration curves, secondary check standards, spikes, blanks, duplicates, ongoing check standards. These are all standard methods for analytical chemists to make sure that they're not generating a random number, because that's always the concern. In my opinion, that's the least, but there's a least potential there for error. It's everything before that can contribute. Would you agree, Bryan? I mean, I just want people to understand that, and I say this because people always point to labs and say that lab's lying, that lab's, faking results. Quite honestly, there's a lot more that goes into it beforehand than the lab generating a sample. I just want you to kind of discuss some of that and make people understand, because I'm sure you get this question a lot from your clients and others.
Yeah, I think the instrument is generally the least part of the concern, because there's so many external, or not external, but additional verifications that are going on with every batch. And so that goes into that calibration. Are you doing, matrix spikes to show that the processing went well? And the instrument has so many internal checks that you just can't have with those other parts of the process, unless you start doing things like field duplicates and so on, where you can get a better idea of how consistent you are from the very start to the finish. So absolutely, the instrument is generally the most sophisticated and the least worrisome part of this. There's so many other stages that go into it, but again, they all come out the final product, which is that final number. And so you'll see that impact only at the end.
Yeah, and also any inspector or auditor could look at the raw data, any trained analytical chemist, and can make sure that the run itself was done right. It's hard to hide that unless you're actually, fudging with the integration of areas under the peak or something. But generally speaking, if it's integrated properly and the run looks good, you can't hide that, but you can hide a lot of stuff beforehand if you wanted to, and you can bias that sample. And the other thing before we get into our now dozen list of questions is I want people to understand variability and how the real world works, and relative versus absolute variability, because I've seen this and heard this a lot. Variability it is a thing that happens in the real world. Nothing is perfect, right? Generally, analytical chemists, depending on what they're doing, will accept 10 or 15% on a relative amount as an error. So just to drive this point home, if you have a 20% sample, if you get your result and says 20% THC, most analytical chemists would assume that 10% of that, or 2% absolute of 20%, so 20% times 10%, so 18 to 22% as an absolute amount, that's kind of your error margin. So if you had another sample that's 21%, an analytical chemist would look at those two numbers, squint their eyes, and go, that's the same number. Is that generally how people should approach these very precise numbers? Because we see this, right, on labels. We see guys, license holders, going to 3 decimals on their analysis, showing extreme precision, and yet the acceptable error is typically on a percent thing. So I don't know if there's anything to add there, Brian, but
I think the best way to describe it is, I just ran a quick number. If you were to do 25 and let's say you had 2 data points and they were 25 and 28, they'd be about 10% different. So I think that's where it can get confusing. You're looking at a relative percent difference, what we call it the RPD. You're not looking at taking 25 and adding 10% and making it 35%. That's not what that calculation means. So it's a little more shocking when you first see it than what it is when you see it in practice. It's also important to remember that window typically gets tighter the more concentrated your sample is. And so at these numbers, potency is a bit unique in the lab industry in that it's highly concentrated and you get higher values. You're not looking for trace amounts. So your variation actually typically goes down when you have high concentrations. I've seen data that's, we have tests that are reported in the nanograms per liter type quadrant, and you'll have 50% variability, and that's good at that level. And so that's something to consider as well. It's actually a pretty narrow window in the grand scheme of things.
That's a great point. I used to work in ultra trace metals, and where we used to do parts per quadrillion, right? And
yeah,
if you were off by 45%, you were still dead on, because the difference between 2 small numbers is very high. However, this is kind of part of our first question from Ramesh. You showed this, Brian. People people see that in the regulations for extracts, for example, you're allowed a 15%, 85 to 115% relative, or difference, right? So what's on the label versus what your lab report shows can be off by 15% relatively. So on a 10% or 1% THC product, that's only 0.15%, right? That's nothing. It's basically, if you have a 1.3% COA and your label shows 1%, you're now technically outside those limits. But because it's relative, if you have an 80% distillate or extract, your COA can be 12% different on the absolute. Your COA could be 68%, and you can still advertise that as 80% or 92. And so people should be aware that nothing's perfect. Don't ever even look at the decimals in cannabinoid analysis. It would be my suggestion, even around to the nearest 5, right? Because realistically, analytically, there's no difference. And yet, a province will not accept a SKU for dry flower, for example, if they want 22%, which they often do, or 23 or 21, and it's 19 or 18. And that's the sad reality. And that's what we have to kind of wrap our heads around in this industry. So Ramesh, I hope we kind of informally answered your first question, but yes, because the 15% relative limit is relative for the whole gamut of potencies, I honestly think it's too high, and it should be kind of bracketed for different kind of limits like they do on the edibles. So on the low end, bigger variability; on the high end, lower variability, because no one really cares about a milligram or 2 per gram, but for 100 milligrams, that makes a difference. Okay, so Brian, I don't know if you can see the Q&A kind of module. We're going to kind of go through one by one. And then again, I'll remind everyone at any point, raise your virtual hand and I'll unmute you and you can have a chat with us. So Dion here asks, what are the most common methods for testing now? And is one method more likely to produce higher potency than the other? So Brian, you kind of touched on this, but what are most labs using or should be using for cannabinoid analysis?
Yeah, what I think is most common is an HPLC with a UV detector. That seems to be the most typical approach. I don't think if you're using a correct method, it shouldn't be any reason to produce higher potency, which is the second part of that question. If it does, then it's not a correct method. But within again, what we were just speaking about, that 15% variation, most of the methods that we've seen, the GC, MS, HPLC, the only variation on that is the HPLC MS, which is probably just a more expensive way of doing it, but would produce excellent data. So yeah, I think for the most part, the method or the instrumentation being used is good. If we want to talk about the most common methods and thinking about method from start to finish, I do think there's a lot of variability in potentially the extraction solvent and the extraction process and the homogenization, and I don't know how everyone does that.
Yeah. And I mean, part of the validation, the EPA or the USP, not for cannabis because they don't have those methods yet, but for any other tests, they're often performance based. The EPA will say, here's our standard method for metals analysis or carbon or whatever. But if you have a better method, or if you have samples that have specific requirements, whether they're saline or have high moisture, you may modify the method as long as you prove through validation that your performance is as good or better than what they expect, right? So it's because people have different equipment, right? We have HPLCs, like you mentioned, Brian, which are the de facto standard with a UV vis detector. GC, just so everyone knows, is not acceptable in Canada at the very least because it decarboxylates as it heats, so you don't get the acids. And Health Canada needs you to report the acids and the neutral cannabinoids. But there's ultra high pressure chromatography. There's some labs have a $200,000 HPLC setup. Some have a $10,000 HPLC setup. Some want more throughput. Some want better resolution on peaks, or some want two cannabinoids. Some want half a dozen of them. So, as an analytical chemist, I don't think it's right that all labs should use the same method, but they should perform to a minimum standard. Would you agree, Brian?
Absolutely, and that's where that external testing through proficiency and so on can verify that, because otherwise, it's hard to tell.
And we'll get into that a little later near the end here, and we'll go past 12 if you don't mind, by 10-15 minutes. I think there's a lot to discuss here, but we'll talk about some solutions here to gain confidence from the consumers, the regulators. But we'll go back to the Q&A here. Ryan Lilico says, what is a suitable internal standard for LC UV analysis? We have been using ibuprofen. Are there any others that may be better? For people that don't know, an internal standard is something that another molecule that behaves similarly to the molecules of interest that you're analyzing, that you run alongside your samples simultaneously. You basically spike them, right? And as a result, if something changes with that internal standard, then it's likely it changed with the actual analyte. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this way you can check that your system is working appropriately. The one that I am most interested in currently is there is cannabinoids available through reputable sellers that are not produced in cannabis. And so the part that still needs to be worked out is in making sure that they don't interfere with any of the other cannabinoids in your system. But I like that approach in just the sense that it should behave the most similar to the other cannabinoids when it comes to the extraction and so on. So that's something that I've looked at. or the internal standard option.
Yeah, ideally it's just a non-natural cannabinoid that, has a very similar structure. What about blanks, Brian? I've seen people use hops as an analog because that's important as a method blank, right? Is that common, or what else do you see on the blank side?
Hemp.
Yeah.
Hemp's another one. Of course, you're going to have maybe some CBD in there or so on, but you can get away with that. What else do we use? Yeah, I think it's mostly hemp, and then you can also do your blank spikes. So you can also use the CRM is another nice one. I realize that's not a blank, but it's a great way to, the concentration that's in it, and you can then verify your system that way. Because you're right, it's hard to find a product that's going to behave exactly like cannabis without using cannabis, and you want to be as close as possible.
And Brian, you just kind of anticipated my next question related to CRMs, or certified reference materials. For people, again, that don't know, it's very common, especially in environmental sciences and other sciences. You purchase a certified reference material from a regulatory body or accredited body that is a common or sample that has an agreed upon amount, right? And by doing rigorous testing, because at the end of the day, without that, your calibrations may be great, but your methods and your extraction, your sample prep, and your robustness of your method may not be good enough when you actually use a plant rather than a refined or purified extract as a calibration. So what is the current state when it comes to CRMs? Are they available, and what are they?
NRC has one for flour,
They do.
and that's the only one that I'm really aware of right now, and we've talked about that. That came about through the lab committee that kind of came available, or everyone was aware of that. So that's one that
that's pretty huge, actually.
Yeah, so they've sent that out. Obviously, the question is about oils and concentrates and so on, but that's another. That'll be at some point we'll get those.
Yeah, and I mean, the good thing about extracts and oils is they're generally a lot more pure, right? Because they've been purified by the very process that manufacturers use to make them. So, and then usually higher potency. I've generally, in my experience, most labs are pretty tight when it comes to extracts, especially distillates or isolates. It's the flour that has inherent variability, and then sampling bias and homogeneity issues that inevitably leads to intra lab or inter-lab variability. Another question here Ramesh has is related to extraction with ethanol. How common is that? I think from my perspective, because ethanol is an excised product, you need denatured ethanol. That's why it's typically not used. But do you see labs using ethanol for sample prep and extraction?
Everyone I've talked to said it just didn't work as well, so there was no reason to use it. It's not significant, but it's enough that there's just no advantage. So I haven't seen it.
Okay. Christopher Gallang here says, are there any difficulties with testing infused matrices, for example, infused pre-roll flowers? So again, there are a lot of issues with testing a more complex sample matrix. But in this case, if you have a flower that's quite complex and you add, some keef, some distillate, whatever the case may be, CO2 oil, are there additional difficulties that you're aware of?
Yes and no. So the first thing would be if it's a pre-roll and it's been infused, that's less of a problem because what you're infusing it with will come out in that solvent quite easily. It's actually where you're trying to get out of the flour that's the problem, or the more challenging extraction part of that extraction. Because what you've infused it with isn't sort of integrated into that flour material. It's going to wash right off pretty quickly. Some of the times, I think what can be a problem there is how you classify it. Is it flour? Is it an extract, and so on? And does the existing validation cover this new product? And I think that's where you go down the conversation of whether the lab wants to do a new validation for your product, or whether there's at least some, again, QC, whether it's matrix spikes and so on, things that we can do to show that this product is still performing well in our test because we're doing some injections as well to show the extraction's been successful and so on. So I think the infused pre-rolls is one that, depending how it is, because I know they can get quite complicated and quite high potency. And so then you have to think about whether you want to have a specific calibration and so on for that product. It's more when you talk about edibles, and the variation in those products is just all over the place. And so I think it's critical.
Yeah, and that's Jeff's next question there. And when it comes to flower, flower is flower. Yes, there's different varieties, but it's flowers. Flower extracts are less complicated matrices typically, so they're even, I would say, arguably easier to test. But what Jeff says and what you just said is quite true. Edibles, I mean, no company probably has the same recipe, right? I mean, jellies, brownies, cookies, freezies, if they're allowed to be sold still. All of these have their own preservatives, stabilizers, emulsifiers, carrier oils. It's almost impossible. It is impossible for a lab to anticipate and validate, their method for every single formulation. So what's the general approach from a lab's perspective when you're developing, edibles came online, was it 2 years ago now? Jellies or kind of gummy candies and chocolates. Like, when is a chocolate and when is a chocolate product not a chocolate, right? How do you?
I know, right? And that's the hard thing, is you have validation for gummies, chocolate, cookies, all sorts of things. But then if the product comes in, how do you know it's the same? And I think one of the things you have to do is that's when you start doing your spikes. So we'll put the cannabinoids in there and make sure they get returned. We'll ask for a blank if we can. Generally, it's easy to get a blank on these edibles. And then we'll do spikes there as well because we want to see the recoveries are as expected. It's, of course, hard. You can't integrate it into the product perfectly, but you'll at least see if there's inhibition and other challenges where you have perhaps overlapping peaks. I think very early on in that slideshow, I showed there was just essentially your chromatogram of the different cannabinoids. As you move down the time, the retention time, you see those peaks. And so if those aren't resolving nicely, that's when you have to consider, okay, is this product going to work properly and what do we have to do to fix that? So there's ways that we can check at least that our outcome is not impeded by the product, and that every lab should be able to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, a real world example that I can just provide on that as an anecdote, as someone who works for a license holder on the processing side, we played with water emulsions for a long time. And we got to a point where we were very happy with the stability, kinetic and thermodynamic stability of our water emulsion. We sent it to a lab and they reported 0 cannabinoids in it, right? Not your lab, Bryan, you would be happy to know. But another unnamed lab, like 0. And we know we put cannabis in there. We sent it to another lab and they reported essentially the exact same amount. And with working with us and kind of us helping them with creating a more robust method, what we theorized was the concentration ended up, we were approaching that actual result because the method was robust enough to break the emulsion and therefore see the cannabinoids. But generally, I think it's the case that you would underreport cannabinoids in a very kind of muddy or complicated matrix because you would have other things interacting with the molecules and kind of hiding them, the cannabinoids. But it is incredibly important, and I think the best thing producers can do is have strict processes on formulation. If they know they put a kilo of 80% distillate into 100 kilos of ingredients, mathematically they should know what to expect in their final piece of chocolate or whatever, as long as their homogenization is correct. Theory and the reality should kind of coalesce to an extent. And if they don't, well, you go back to the drawing board. You first look, did we mess up at the license holder? And if not, try other labs, other methods, and look at that. But I think there's a responsibility for the license holder and the lab both. But ultimately, regulations require the license holder, the producer, to be responsible for all of this.
And I think your anecdote there, just I wanted to quickly share a lesson learned on my side when it comes to the beverages is for the labs, they have to consider their detection limit, because if you're doing a 10 milligram per unit, a beverage can be quite a high volume, and your detection limit might not actually be appropriate for how much THC is in a small amount of that liquid. So that's something else you have to watch out for too.
Total polar opposite to extracts, which are 80%. Beverages could be 0.1, 0.01% by weight, because there's only 10 milligrams in half a liter or something. I do, and there's a few more questions. We'll get through them all. Some really good ones. I do want to just kind of cover this topic because I've done this personally. I keep hearing this. We've discussed this before. This always comes up, and people see a high THC result. And by the way, for dried flower, just so everyone is aware, if you look at any data set or most data sets in the States, in Canada, where they have access to analytical data, the average potency of dried flower sold is 18 to 20%. Okay. The variability, the standard deviation is about 5%. So if we just take 20 as a round number, you'd expect if your lab did 1,000 samples, your average would be 20%. You might get some 22, 23, 25. Once you start approaching 27 or 28% THC, you are now in a highly improbable territory. It doesn't mean it's impossible for you to achieve that or for a grower to achieve that in a crop, but anything over 28, 30, you're basically an outlier. So for the consumers out there, if you start seeing labels with 28, 30, 32%, and it's not an infused flower, you have to ask yourself what's going on. And again, is it the person sampling? Is it the lab? I hear this time and time and again. Oh, there are unscrupulous labs that you pay enough money and they'll get you the result you want. And a lot of the time people say this is because they dry the sample, right? So you take a flower, let's say 50-gram sample, you send it to a lab. The lab is supposed to take that sample, preserve its integrity, and test and report as is, right? This is in the sample based on the moisture currently, not as an anhydrous or dry weight basis, like can be done. So a lot of people say, well, the lab gets the sample and then they over dry it. And oh, now your 18% turns into 25. And I just want to show this, and I've done this before, tweeted about this last year. Mathematically, that's impossible. If you have a 12% moisture sample, something that's basically on the wet side, right, of stability, like you don't want anything more moist than 12% on a flower. If you tested that bud and it came back at 25% THC, if it was truly 25% THC, if you removed all the moisture you can in a drying room down to 6% where it's bone dry, and you redid that test on that same bud somehow, it would only report 26.6%. We're talking at the high end, 1 to 2% elevation. So you're not going to take an 18% bud and turn it to 33. You just won't, over drying it. And if that is happening, that's a simple thing for an inspector to figure out. So I think when people start looking at high values, I'm not saying it's impossible. I want to be very clear here. We have a lot of people producing the great flower here, but I want to make it absolutely clear that be skeptical. And the first question you should ask is this consistent for the producer? And if they're sharing COAs, where is that COA coming from? Because something's a little off there, very likely, or they're just doing a heck of a job. But we keep seeing this creep in the industry, right, of inflated potency. And I personally don't think it's overdrawing that's causing it. I honestly think it's probably sampling and sampling prep at the lab. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that here. Now I will go back to the Q&A and both David Baranovsky and Gord here, who's very active on Twitter, very transparent. Thank you for joining us, Gord. I think you're still here. They both kind of asked somewhat of the same question. David asked, to what extent has Health Canada requested test results and samples from CARO? So in other words, is Health Canada monitoring different labs? And Gord is looking at, whether there's a group of labs that have done inter-lab confirmations or proficiency testing. And if so, what percentage are participating, or in other words, like, should they participate? So we're talking about the controls or regulations or transparency. What have you seen from Health Canada, and what have you seen from the industry, and what would you like to see?
Yeah, it looks like Jeff responded to Gordon's question on the proficiency testing, which I think is about accurate, which is every 6 months and about 20 labs participating or so. So that sounds about right. I think if you're an accredited lab, that you have to participate in proficiency testing in order to maintain that accreditation. So you can kind of gather how many people are doing it. And that's the only way it's being done.
And you mean ISO accredited, right? ISO 17025?
ISO accredited, exactly. And that's generally through CALO or the Standards Council of Canada. So sort of the two options we have. And so there's some PT that goes into that. I know as a lab, we've also done, the odd study between labs to see what's happening and what people are getting back. That's not done with any kind of, cadence that's set or anything. It just comes up from time to time when you're working on something. But that's been a really nice thing. And I think one of the things that's, critical through the C45 is just the participation and sort of the support that we give each other. And yes, we all have our competitors in some way, but in the other way, we're also here to support the industry and to do the best that we can. And I think the only thing that helps the clients in general, right, is that knowing that the labs are working together to support them and make sure that Canada has a very well-regulated industry. What would I like to see? We need something, and this conversation comes up in a lot of the C45 meetings, is what should we do? And should we ask for accreditation? Should there be forcing that? Should we have standard methods? I think the standard methods that's going to take time to really implement that and get it into place. The quickest thing that could be done is requesting proficiency testing and having a standard, and have all the labs who Health Canada sees participate in those round robins and make sure that they can accurately represent THC and other things that, for that matter, pesticides, metals, the things that really can generate health risks. That would be a quick thing that could be done. I don't know that Health Canada does. I don't believe they request much from us directly. My guess is if they are looking at our reports, it's typically through our clients, from what I've heard, and they'll just pull them from them.
That's my understanding. And some of the feedback we've given on behalf of our association directly to Health Canada is you should be keeping a closer eye on labs, because they do a really good job with license holders, right, generally. But they seem to just give a lab a license to handle this material, and the onus is actually on the license holder, the processor, the cultivator, to make sure the labs are using validated methods. But as long as the lab gives you a one-page PDF with a signature saying this is validated, that's the minimum standard everyone wants, and then you move on with your life. But given the implications for excise, right, extracts are directly related to potency for excise, right? The more THC you have, the more you pay in excise. They should, in my opinion, have a much bigger role in especially potency, but also in other analyses, but especially potency, in making sure that there's a level playing field. The methods don't have to be the same, but the validations have to have a minimum standard. You should have a minimum limit of detection. You should have some linearity that you have, minimum you have to kind of achieve some sort of, acceptable acceptance tolerance on your errors. Maybe 15% is too high. Maybe it should be 10. Who knows? And really, I don't know if they have the internal capacity. I know they have some great people that used to work for the industry that now work for Health Canada that could provide them that capacity, but I'd like to see that. I think the industry would like to see that, because it would level the playing field, much like the regulations have leveled the playing field for the production, cultivation, processing of cannabis. So,
yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say, this industry is also 4 years old now. When was your validation done?
Yeah. Since then, you've had half dozen staff cycle through, and 10 new columns and what have you. So I think there needs to be, Health Canada needs to do better. The industry needs to do better. This is an opportunity for the industry to have to work on itself to build consumer confidence. Sometimes we don't have to wait for regulations. We shouldn't. We should just take it on ourselves. It's easier said than done, I know, but That's kind of one hope. And the other thing, I keep mentioning this study almost every time this topic comes up. There's a fantastic study published by Nick Jikomes of Leafly in the Journal of Nature, one of their sub publications, looking at Washington data sets. And what they did is in Washington State, all labs have to submit their results to the state, to the governing, to the regulator. So through the, I guess, the Freedom of Information request, they had access to tens of thousands of lab tests, anonymized, but they were classified per lab. And just using simple descriptive statistics, right? Average, standard deviation, frequency, histograms, they were able to look at what these labs are reporting and very quickly identify labs that were potentially biasing, either on purpose or accidentally through poor methods, poor QC. And I think from that, one or two labs ended up losing their license because it was clear that they were the go-to labs in the state that almost guaranteed 2 or 3 or 5% benefit on the THC. And again, when your sales, when your livelihood, when your success of your business depends on that one number, it's unfortunate that it does, but it does in this, especially in Canada, where people can't see a product. The market forces will inevitably drive people to do silly things or behave poorly or unethically. So I really hope we see something happen with the labs. There is only benefit in my mind. And, without that, this lab shopping, this speculation that some labs are better than others will continue. And I don't think that's very healthy for this industry. So I hope you agree. And I think you do.
Absolutely.
Gord or David, does that answer your questions? Since I think you're still on here, now's the time to kind of speak up, and if not, we'll kind of wrap it up here. So last opportunity for everyone to raise your hand virtually if you want to say something on the mic or provide a comment or the Q&A. But if not, we have two more questions. Anchor says, I wanted to know if there's any data that corresponds to stability of standard stock when kept in appropriate conditions. So I guess this is kind of part of the kinetic paper you kind of showed, right? I mean, generally, if you keep stuff in a fridge, it's pretty stable for a year, right?
Yeah, and it's mostly anecdotal evidence. I think the problem was twofold. One was the standards not being as labeled, which was a problem in the past. It's gotten a lot better. The other is keeping in the fridge is one thing, but then also the problem being you only use a very small amount of that standard once you open it. So considering how you store it beyond once it's been opened, right? Not just temperature, but what other things can you do to make sure oxidation is decreased and so on. But I haven't seen anything. I haven't seen a study that goes into the standards specifically, because obviously it's a slightly different matrix than flour, but I would expect similar sort of decreases over a month, let's say that 2%.
Yeah. The papers that I've read looking either kinetic models or actual, physical sampling, all, temperature and oxygen, but mostly temperatures and light are the big factors. So again, a fridge is, more than capable of holding that kind of, that stability on. And what's the expiry on these standards? Typically 6 months or a year?
Yeah, usually 6 months to a year.
6 months, right?
Ideally, you don't, ideally use them up before the expiry, typically. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And Katie here has a question coming back to the tolerance limits for extract. So again, right now we have tolerance limits, established criteria by the regulations by Health Canada for extracts, 15% and topicals, I believe, plus minus. So again, it's much higher at the high end than on the low end. We have tolerance limits for edibles, and they did something smart. The smaller amount of THC you have, I believe it's 0 to 2, and then 2 to 5, and 5 to 10 milligrams. They're different brackets, right? They have different tolerance amounts, but there's no tolerance for flour. I honestly think there should be. There's examples in the last year or two of certain companies using static labeling for dried flour, which saves a lot on costs and in fact makes interpreting lots a little easier. But there's no such thing for dried cannabis. Whatever the COA says is with the number you put on the label. And I think there should be tolerance limits, because again, the number that's reported by the lab to do 2 decimals has an inherent variability, inherent error. Those last 2 decimals don't matter on a percentage basis, and I wish that actually we can move to a more rounded set of numbers where people don't look at so precisely and weigh the potency so heavily. Would you agree, Bryan? I mean, you're not on that side of the industry, you're on the testing side, but why hasn't Health Canada put those regulations in place? Is there a benefit to not having static labeling?
Yeah, and I wonder if the reason it may just be the consumption of, whether it's the consumption of flower they view differently than something that's going to be ingested and so on. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that 15% is reasonable. I was just going to say, I've looked at our data, as I said, because we are, you have a batch duplicate. So we have batches going back for years. I can see what the variability is with internal samples, and it's under 15%. So there's no reason why you couldn't have that as a standard.
Absolutely. And that's, again, relative, which means on a 20% absolute potency, it's only plus minus 2% THC,
exactly.
Right? It's 2 or 3%. It's not a lot. It's within any reasonable error. Okay, so I think we've gone through the questions here. Last chance, but if not, feel free to reach out to myself. If you want to get connected to Bryan, give me an email at tom@c45association.com. More than happy to chat. I think today was great, Bryan. I hope people walk away understanding a bit more of what it takes to generate a sample, understand the potential for error, understand some of the deficiencies in the regulated market as far as who's watching these labs, who's saying these methods are good or bad. So all of that, I think, is important. And I do hope we move to a more transparent industry, especially on the THC testing. And I really do hope that some of the major labs take it upon themselves to band together. Perhaps C45 Quality Association Lab Committee is the platform to do that, but perhaps not. But take it upon themselves to do proficiency testing, round robin testing, transparently report some of this. And the C45 Quality Association is actually looking at whether we can do our own blinded round robin test to kind of show publicly the potential for error when you send the same sample or same lot to different labs. Because in my experience, if you use a good lab and you use a proper sampling method, you can control a lot of that variability, and it's not there. But sometimes that's not the case for everyone. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Bryan. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you have any questions, let us know. Check us out online. And if you are someone who would like to put on a presentation like this, or someone, especially when it comes to lab testing, we'd love to do a series like this for pesticides, heavy metals, micro. So please, reach out and put your hand up, and we'd love to host you. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Take care and have a good week.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you.